Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you for attending this ELI webinar, which is co-sponsored by the American Bar Association section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. My name is Alda Yuan. I'm a visiting attorney here at ELI. In a moment, I'm going to turn things over to Noble, who will be our moderator, and will introduce the panelists. Then, before we get to the main event, I'll give some brief remarks about the BRIGHT project and model. So Noble, I'll turn things over to you.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well today. My name is Noble Smith. As mentioned before, I'm a 3L at Howard University School of Law. In the fall of 2020, I was an ELI intern and was working on the BRIGHT project. But today we're talking about Whitesburg, and I would love to introduce our panelists. To begin, we have Shane Barton, the Downtown Revitalization Coordinator and Community Economic Development Initiative at the University of Kentucky. We also have Marley Green, a community development worker at the Apple Shop. Valerie Horn, head of the Lecter County Farmers Market and the Kane Kitchen, as well as Missy Matthews, the chair of the Lecter County Tourism Commission. Alda, turning over back to you.
Thank you, Noble. So before we get started, I'm just going to say a brief word about the BRIGHT project, which provides some of the conceptual model for the work you're going to hear more about today. So first off, BRIGHT stands for Blight Revitalization Initiative for Green, Healthy Towns. So as you can see, the BRIGHT project basically seeks to empower communities to address blight in their neighborhoods through community-led redevelopment and revitalization. The core of the model is revitalization through what's called a corridor project planning process. So corridor projects try to catalyze redevelopment by spreading infrastructure spending and efforts across different projects along a transportation corridor or just specifically in a given geographical area. By planning across multiple projects at once, communities can build buy-in across multiple stakeholder groups, respond to a variety of needs, and layer projects on top of each other to create a whole that's more than the sum of its parts. The panel will talk about how this model or something like it was used in Whitesburg, Kentucky as a basis for a very extensive planning process. And throughout the consuming conversation, you'll see how most of these elements were incorporated in their project. So before I turn things back over to the panel and sort of, let you guys hear from the people that you came to hear from, I should note that the BRIGHT team has been developing an interactive online guide to help other communities do the same. So please keep an eye out for that announcement. All right, back over to you all.
Great, thank you, Alda. So Marley, I would love for you to talk about your experience with BRIGHT and then connect that to the Whitesburg project as a whole.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, thanks everybody for joining today. Yeah, my name's Marley Green, and I work for Apple Shop in Whitesburg, Kentucky. And so Apple Shop's an arts and media organization primarily. We were started in 1969 as part of a War on Poverty program to do kind of workforce training and job training around, particularly around film. Part of the original idea was to try to create a new kind of economic activity around filmmaking in Eastern Kentucky. And over the years, Apple Shop sort of transformed into a multimedia arts and education organization. But that initial thing of kind of economic development, community development, wanting to, create a kind of new opportunities in Eastern Kentucky has remained kind of part of what we do. And so now we have a record label, we have a theater company, we have a radio station that broadcasts to Eastern Kentucky and Southwest Virginia and around the region. We continue to train young people to make documentary films. And in the last 10 years or so, along with a lot of the arts world, Apple Shop started getting involved with kind of creative placemaking and using arts and culture as a way to help, spur on economic community development projects to, kind of reactivate downtown spaces and places where maybe communities have been struggling economically. And that's certainly true in Eastern Kentucky. We've had many years of kind of economic decline, largely related to the decline in the coal industry, and kind of trying to forge a new economic identity and opportunity. And Eastern Kentucky has been, a challenge that a lot of people from a lot of different angles, a lot of organizations are trying to wrestle with. And so Appleshop's been trying to be, a more proactive partner in some of those projects in the last, 10 years, especially. So I kind of came, Appleshop and Bright kind of started to intersect. I was a student at UVA in Charlottesville, at the Urban and Environmental Planning program there, and had been a volunteer with Appleshop with the radio station, and had gotten to know some folks like Valerie here, and been a little bit involved in some community projects, and wanted to kind of learn more about how community economic development can happen in a good, sustainable way. And so I went to grad school, and during that time, I think ELI reached out to Appleshop looking for potential partners to explore and develop the Bright sort of framework for community development, economic development in environmental justice communities, especially. And some of my background had been in environmental justice, kind of community organizing, looking at some of the systemic issues, around disinvestment and inequality here in Central Appalachia, and some of the kind of environmental legacies of some of the industries here in the region. So there was, I think Eli kind of reached out to Appleshop and said, is this something you all or anybody in the region that's working on these kinds of projects that would like to partner with ELI? And so I was able to catch wind of it through some friends at Appleshop, and we put together a team of students to work on a kind of semester-long project in partnership with Appleshop and with other folks in Whitesburg to put together a kind of assessment and analysis using the Bright framework for what opportunities there might be in downtown Whitesburg, to use this model to spur some economic development, some community development projects, some and to also bring in the Appleshop kind of artistic, creative perspective on it. So I think that's kind of how I initially got involved. We developed this report with a team of students, and then when I finished at school, was able to transition into a position and kind of newly created position at Appleshop focused on kind of community development. How can having, the first time in a long time that Appleshop had staff that was specifically focused on how can we support community projects. We'd been doing a little bit of it over the years before, and had initiated a kind of countywide community development project called the Letcher County Culture Hub, which is continued, but then wanted to really kind of focus on development projects, right? Concrete, kind of focused development projects. So that was 2017. And I think shortly after that, Shane came, I met Shane. Shane was managing a new, really exciting community development program through SEDIC, and Missy Matthews around that same time became chair of the Letcher County Tourism Commission, and was really excited and focused on developing trails, and that was a good fit for the Bright model, I think, and kind of walkability and healthy downtown living. And Val has been a really critical part of a lot of different kinds of community development projects in Whitesburg, including the farmers market. There's a community canning kitchen and event space that she spearheaded development of, and I'm hoping you all will talk more, but I just want to say around that time, I think a lot of factors came together. We were able to kind of use this report as a first layer of kind of like to-do list. From Appleshop perspective, at least, this has really served as a roadmap And the model of thinking about the whole kind of corridor has carried through to our work now. And so, yeah, we've just kind of been slowly ticking away at different pieces of it. And I'm hoping, yeah, we can, I can stop talking and can let a video play here soon, but I don't know if there are other lead-in questions you want to start with.
No, that'd be great, Marley. I think the video does a good job of introducing Whitesburg, and then I will actually go to Shane following the video just for a little more explanation.
Cool. Let's see, I'll do the share screen over here.
Hosted in downtown Whitesburg earlier today, celebrating the opening of the Bowlings North Fork Veranda, an outdoor eating area and event space. WYMT's Emily Bennett tells us how community members hope it will help revitalize downtown.
How good does it feel to be able to gather again?
The former Salyer Radio Company building in downtown Whitesburg has a long history, and now it is being brought back to life.
It was just so beautiful to me. I saw the beauty in it, and I knew that we could make something out of it. I didn't want it tore down.
Mary Bowling bought the building in 2015 and kept searching for the perfect way to use it for the community.
It's one of a kind.
After seeing an outdoor eating area on vacation, Letcher County Tourism Chairman Missy Matthews approached Bowling about turning this building into a similar space. As COVID brought to light, there are no outdoor eating spaces in town.
So there's no picnic tables, there's no shelter area. You sit on the church steps. Most of the time people will get carry out and sit on the church steps in town or the curb.
Through a grant and community partners, the space was transformed.
And we see concerts, we see receptions, we see weddings. It's a fun space that I think will be very versatile for our community.
All with the goal of creating a better community, encouraging people to stay here in the mountains.
For us, it's just creating, improving the quality of life for people that already live here.
And the community, well, they are already putting it to use.
Instantly, when we put the tables in, the whole afternoon people started using it. And there was 3 guys with backpacks and computers studying, doing homework down here yesterday afternoon.
1, 2, 3.
Excited to create new memories within these 4 walls. In Whitesburg, Emily Bennett, WYMT Mountain News.
The building is located off East Main Street on River Road. Wi-Fi is going to be available for people to study and host meetings. If you're interested in booking the venue, you can do so by contacting Letcher County Tourism. Was hosted.
Great, thank you, Marley. So Shane, could you speak a little bit about the Whitesburg community, important stakeholders, as well as people, I guess, outside of quote unquote the community that are still very helpful in this project?
Yeah, thanks, Noble, and it's a pleasure to be here with everybody. The video that Marley just shared, every time I see that, it gives me goosebumps, in particular when you see the before pictures of that space. Like Marley said, we really started to get to know each other around 2017, which coincided with a substantial grant that SEDC here at the University of Kentucky received, one of the power grants from the Appalachia Regional Commission. And what that grant allowed us to do here in our unit was really to focus and make some crucial investments around downtown revitalization. And that is such a broad term, really, but I'll try to tease out a little bit about what that meant. But what that program allowed us to do was to work with Letcher County, along with 7 other counties in Eastern Kentucky that are considered part of the Kentucky Promise Zone. So these are communities that have been severely impacted by a transitioning the economy away from extraction, mainly coal. And these opportunities, these funds, we really saw as an opportunity to kickstart a number of efforts similar to what Marley had just articulated a moment ago. Some communities were sort of planned a little bit, and luckily Marley brought that with some of the Bright programming and had kind of a preliminary vision. Other communities had ideas, but they hadn't really put all of the pieces together. But what our effort allowed us to do was to work not only individually with each community, with their stakeholders, many on the call and the panel today, but also work really with the region as a whole. So that program allowed us to deploy a number of very specific technical assistance programs, like a first impressions program that we offered that is similar to a secret shopper campaign, but we send volunteers to your community unannounced, and they provide great feedback. We also were able to launch a business retention and expansion program, some youth engagement programming. And then as a part of that funding that we received, we were actually able to, for the first time, hire a landscape architect that could really help us do some downtown design and planning. So all of that said, it really allowed us to work with individual partners where they needed it. You know, often universities get a bad rap by kind of parachuting in and saying, hey, you need this and you need this. But what I really appreciated about this opportunity is it allowed us really to curate the sort of experience that those local community stakeholders needed. As a part of that program, we brought all of the stakeholders together once a quarter and had a regional in-person convening, which feels like we have to say in person now that everything is virtual. And you know, those were attended by 60 or so folks, and each team would bring their sort of representatives, and together we would talk about the challenges we're facing. We would talk about different technical assistance or do trainings that would help move different efforts along. But in terms of those stakeholders, not only do we have sort of that local capacity and staff members like Marley, who's affiliated with an organization that's dedicated to that community, but also local leaders and champions like Val and Missy. So often we would have tourism, we would have the Chamber of Commerce, Kentucky Main Street, local foundation or philanthropic organizations. We would often work with local government or those departments, in particular public works, when things needed to be installed. But the thing that I really appreciated about the Promise Zone effort that I'm talking about is that we also embedded in our grant a substantial amount of money that we could then invest in communities and have them apply for grants to implement their idea. Because rarely do these sorts of planning opportunities come with functional funds that you can actually do the thing with. And I was really excited that we were able to do some things. So in Whitesburg, we were able to invest in some connectivity and local infrastructure related to the trail system. Whitesburg was also the only community that put some investments in their green infrastructure to think about future water quality. But it was all built on the sort of groundwork that Marley and others had started to work on with Bright and thinking about those corridors. And it was just the perfect time that we were able to amplify some of that and leverage the work that they were doing really to justify some substantial funding. And then later, after that effort, working with those same regional partners with SEDC and local philanthropic organizations like the Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky and Hazard, we were also able to respond to COVID impacts. And the project that Marley had shown was a result of that latter partnership where we as organizations were trying to invest even more funds to stack some capital to try to, in all words, keep our communities alive and keep local businesses viable. We knew that folks were pivoting and that local businesses were sort of the foundation to what we wanted to do in all of our communities. And in Whitesburg, the idea to create this outdoor seating, this flexible space that could accommodate some of the local restaurants and provide public health opportunities to gather in an open outdoor space. You know, we were all trying to sort of figure out what were best practices as we try to reopen in the world of COVID. And we really focused on what are some of those available spaces that we can invest in to help contribute to problem solving right now, but also leave a legacy site that can be an influential property or an influential site for generations to come. And I think that's really what we were able to pull together, not just in the region, but with great partners there in Whitesburg. For us, it was about getting the right folks involved, introducing them to other folks in other communities facing similar challenges, leveraging the funding and the investments, and then the latter being able to stack those investments with other opportunities to really make them even bigger and more impactful.
Great, thank you, Shane. I think that was very important to hear about, you know, how everything came together and the work that you're continuing to do. I apologize earlier. I failed to mention there will be a question and answer portion after all of our panelists speak. So if there are participants that have some questions, if you could just type a chat directly to the host, we will be able to cover those at the end of the panel discussion. But now I want to move on to Missy Matthews, who is the chair of the Letcher County Tourism. And I really want to sort of tease out something that Shane was mentioning about these intersections between sort of agencies and other community partners. And I really wanted to highlight your role, Missy. So if you could speak about, you know, how the County Tourism Board and, you know, these corridor projects sort of intersect, and, you know, how other similar type agencies would serve this role.
Thank you for including me today. I guess I could start by saying that I think that my friends on this call would agree that 5 years ago, 6 years ago, Letcher County could be a part of a totally different webinar about maybe being in the opposite frame of mind as this webinar. But I think that myself and Marley and Valerie have proven that people can work together if they focus on what they have in common and what their common goals are. One thing I can say about the three of us is we are very goal and results oriented. I think that our success has been in part that we respect each other and we appreciate each other's viewpoints and opinions. And each one of us has a specific talent. And that goes for anybody else that was a part of this that is not on this call, is we embrace the abilities that each of us have, and we hand off the baton when we need to, with complete trust and support for each other, that the next one that has it will carry it until they need to hand it off to somebody else. I think in small towns, there's a lot of emotion and ego that gets involved, that gets in the way and that muddies the water. And I'm proud to say that I don't feel any of that. A matter of fact, when I was asked to be included in this, the fact that Marley asked me to, I didn't ask any questions. I just knew that I needed to be a part of this because I wanted to support Marley. You know, so that's a perfect example of us just trusting each other and knowing that we all want something bigger and better for our community. That I don't know if that gives you the valuable information that you were looking for, but that's my perspective on the success of our projects.
Missy, could you talk just a little to like how tourism specifically, like why tourism's gotten involved in, you know, sort of the downtown development stuff over the last few years? And if it's just because you like me, I mean, that's fine, but.
Oh, well, I mean, it's, you know, my responsibility, I feel like, as the tourism chairman, is to build up all of our assets that we possibly can. You know, you've heard me say polish the apple. So we have a lot of apples that needed to be polished, and it's, you know, another cliche is low-hanging fruit. We don't have a lot of money to spend, so there's a lot that we can do just by rolling up our sleeves. And downtown Whitesburg already had a lot of assets that we just needed to freshen up a little bit. And with the help that Shane has provided, it made it it made us get results faster. So we could have chosen some other projects, but I don't think we would have gotten the results that we've gotten as quickly as we've gotten. And that has helped with the momentum that the community is feeling right now. It's funny because the surrounding communities talk about all the things we're doing. And I mean, in a way, I just got to laugh because it's just us rolling up our sleeves and people like us doing, smaller projects that people can see. It's tangible. But yeah, I'm heavily focused. Tourism is heavily focused in all those small cities that we have, but Whitesburg being our county seat, and it already has the trail, and the hope is to add to that trail. But Marley, I have to grin a little bit when you asked me that, because the very first time I met you, I found out about a grant that I didn't even know existed, and it was like my second day on the job. So yeah, it's almost was a forced march on day 2 to concentrate on the trail that I didn't even know was going to be my responsibility. Thanks to you for helping with that.
Thank you, Missy. I think it's really important, to highlight the personal relationships that also help develop in this community and help, strengthen what's already there. And I think Valerie, our next panelist, can really speak and highlight, the importance of community engagement and stakeholder management as these projects get going and continue their success throughout the years.
So thank you for being including me in this, and thanks to those of you who are listening and are here for that. It's wonderful for our community to think and know that people are looking at Whitesburg for the good things that are happening here. Often that is not the case, and it sort of makes me emotional that we are in that place now, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate each of you who are listening. So my name is Valerie Horn, and I'm the director at Cowan Community Center, which began about the same time Appalshop began, also as an initiative of the War on Poverty. And we're still working on that. But I have, in my lifetime and experience, I've been a school counselor, so I've been pretty engaged with families and how community is living. It's been somewhat siloed in the school system, but I feel like right now we are at our community is at a tipping point, and that we do have some of the best cooperation and vision and leadership that we have had, and there are a lot of good opportunities for our community. So Cowan is a community center outside of Whitesburg, but we like to believe that we have a pretty big reach, and it's certainly, our programs are not specific to only the Cowan community. We work with tourism and Appalshop. I began my work there with a gardening program, Grow Appalachia, which is across about 5 states in central Appalachia. And from that, the Grow Appalachia program grew into a farmer's market to have a place to grow beyond just for your family, and eventually to Kane Kitchen, a commercial processing area for farmers to grow with. The work that we do, I sort of like to describe as just growing a healthy community. And there are a lot of aspects with that go well beyond exam rooms and medication. And we have strong partners that are not represented here, but that are a big part of the work in our medical communities. Both Mountain Comprehensive Health Corporation has been a longtime partner with the farmers market and working to get access for families who need it to fresh and local food. Appalachian Regional Healthcare support with the Levitt Amp Whitesburg Music Series, tourism, Appalshop, Missy's personal businesses are all supporters of that we rely on to bring 10 weeks of free concerts to the community, because our goal is to make communities that people want to live in. We recognize that choices are, people are going to be able to choose where they live and where we work. And we want to bring in those salaried positions to our community, and they feel good about the quality of life that they'll have here. Just like we want the people who have always lived here in the head of a holler or beside the road to have access to those things also. One of the it's an honor to be with Missy and Marley, both leaders in this, and to have to know that when you have ideas, that there are resources and Shane to make them happen. I've said before to others that you can have good ideas. A lot of people have good ideas, but if you don't have the support and resources to make them come to life, then it's disappointing, and you don't get to see that happen. And I think that's what's happening here, is that we have met with some success, and people are seeing that happen, so they're willing to invest in and to grow this community to be stronger. One quote I have, Marianne Williams, is that in every community, there's work to be done. In every nation, there are wounds to heal. In every heart, there's power to do it. I sort of edit that a little bit, that in our community, we do have the power to heal issues, or even if it's not heal, to improve, to make better, to grow a community that people want to live in, want to visit, and can have the choice about staying here. So my roles have been with food, with music and culture activities. I was really happy this summer that we were able to have an internship program, and that was with support from Gear Up, a state program, and East Kentucky Concentrated Employment. So we were able to bring 35 rising juniors and seniors and place them in about 15 organizations, community, private, and for-profit business across the county. Both tourism and Appalshop had that. So we're looking at how do we sustain this? Who's going to fill Marley's place? Who's going to fill Missy's place? How do we get engagement from these students? I'm happy to say when the program ended, they're still showing up at the farmers market. They're still showing up at the Levitt shows. So we're happy with that buy-in. We work with the summer food service program and have partner sites with that also. Last year, Kane Kitchen and Cowan partnered together, and we were able to serve meals from May to August. We served 700,000 meals. And for perspective, when we started the program in 2014, we did 700 meals the first summer. Last year with COVID, 700,000, probably some of the highest numbers in the nation of meals that were passed out to 8 communities here. I sometimes refer to Cowan, Kane, and the farmers market as 3 sisters. In line with the growing that happens with corn and squash and beans, to make the most resources and produce the most with the least amount of resources there. And it does work, but it sure can get messy too when you walk in those weeds and in that garden. But we keep trying, and we'll keep planting. So that's my part. I echo everything that Missy and Marley said, and especially about Missy. Just, you know, I saw something about how insignificant our time is here. So sometimes I need to remind myself that it can't all be fixed right now, but if we can just keep running with that baton and do our part, then we'll leave it a little better off.
Great. Thank you, Valerie. I think what you said is really important. You know, recognizing that we can't fix everything right now, but if we plan and, you know, include culture, food, music in how we plan, we can really set up things better for the future. Before we get to the Q&A, I think Aldo wants to share a quick visual about the work that has been done to give our panelists a little more, our participants a little more framework for where we are.
Yeah, I just thought sort of, thank everybody for essentially kind of talking about what brought them to this work and a lot of what kind of inspires you and sort of drives it forward. In preparation for the group discussion and the Q&A, I thought it would be nice for the participants to take a look at some of the products and some of the planning that you all have participated in and actually produced. So I just brought up this sort of visual right here of the virtual tour. So I'm just going to go through a few slides just so people get a sense of some of the planning process that actually occurred. So first, here's a map of the the Whitesburg area. And if anybody in the panelists want to jump in and sort of, point out particular aspects of it, obviously feel free. I think it's important to get a sense of realizing that sort of the panelists are really tapped into their communities. That was very clear in what they said, right? Sort of the understanding of what the community actually needs is a big part of Bright, right? It's not just about redevelopment or revitalization, it's about community-led revitalization. So that requires understanding what the community needs are, what the community looks like, and sort of, what is sort of like a lot of what Valerie was saying, sort of like planning for the future of the community, right? Not just physical buildings, but also arts and culture and kind of what the environment of the community is like. So next we have sort of a map of the downtown, and sort of you can see that there are places where the water is marked and sort of aspects of kind of what the community is not just sort of like the resources that are available, but the possibilities, right? So speaking to that, there's a couple of slides here that talk about kind of vacant buildings that existed in downtown, and sort of clearly that was a catalyst for thinking about what could be in those buildings, what could sort of the community look like. Again, sort of like there were connections in the downtown area to the river and sort of farmers market, sort of again possibilities, and also involved understanding what the community actually like required and what it could look like. So I'll just end here, but this is sort of like the map again of the downtown. If any of the panelists want to speak more precisely to kind of the making of the map, but you can see that sort of in the legend on the bottom left, there are sort of labels of some of what kind of was imagined in this holistic planning process. It wasn't about sort of just picking one specific property and then building sort of like some luxury condos or whatever it is that developers are kind of really focused on. It was about kind of thinking about how do we make this downtown area a place where people want to go and want to live and want to sort of like raise their families and sort of like live whole lives. So just with that, I'll sort of turn it back over to the panelists and then perhaps to Noble to start the group discussion, but wanted to sort of get people to actually see, what does this community that we're all talking about actually look like.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in and just say, I think part of what was compelling to us about the Bright model for this planning product that you're seeing here, again, this is I think this is the UVA student group from 2017 put together this map and some other maps that were shared on the info site about this webinar. And I think we should follow up with some other documents that show how some of these ideas have come into fruition. But what was compelling and relevant about the Bright model is that downtown Whitesburg has experienced a lot of business loss. There are vacant and falling down buildings, and there is at the heart of it this corridor of the former rail line. So Whitesburg was kind of built around the rail line as it came in the early 20th century. And in the late 20th century, the rail line was pulled up through downtown. And so community groups started working on turning that into a walking trail in the late 90s, I think, early 2000s. And there's been a few kind of efforts to kind of extend the trail through all of downtown. And it makes a really clear kind of pedestrian corridor. And then there have been a number of kind of private investors in downtown working on kind of rehabilitating old buildings, creating new restaurants and bars and housing in the sort of core of the main street, but there wasn't necessarily good connection between those buildings and kind of other parts of town, or disconnect points between the walking trail and some of those businesses. But what the walking trail and the old rail line corridor allows you to do is to connect that downtown to schools. So if we were able to zoom out, and I'd encourage anybody to kind of check out on Google Maps, and I think there are some other available maps, but on the west end of town, there's an elementary school, there's City Park, there's sort of subsidized housing units, and then there's grocery stores on one kind of west end of town. And on the east end of town, there's another City Park, and then a hospital. And a little further on, there's a high school. We're sort of working on extending the trail to connect all of these kind of community assets in a way that really allows people to actually move through town more efficiently by foot or bike than by car, because the car, the road kind of follows the river. And so, yeah, it just became a real clear fit that we had these kind of vacant and abandoned buildings downtown, but we had some amazing assets that could be better connected in between those, and that those vacant and abandoned buildings could be, new assets along this kind of chain of community services, amenities. And so that the Bright framework really lended itself to that. And then that we did have this relationship with the farmers market, with Kane, that was part of what was happening downtown already, and that Val and others were really trying to activate a space downtown for food and making connections with the hospital and the health clinics. They also see food, and pedestrian walkability as part of improving health outcomes, which helps their bottom line. If people in community are healthier, they're spending less for better outcomes. So they have really invested in some of these projects as well. But yeah, that kind of food, healthy living also really fit into the Bright model of, kind of green, healthy. And one aspect we haven't really talked about so far, but is through this process, we were thinking more about solar and energy efficiency as part of kind of what downtown development can look like. And through this process, we've also, the Apple Shop building has installed solar, and there's a housing nonprofit also in this corridor that's installed solar on their buildings, and a business on the kind of east end of town that's also installed solar. So thinking about kind of energy and energy efficiency as part of this. Yeah, and then I think, this plan also got it, and the Bright model got us thinking a little more about green infrastructure and ways to bring, kind of sustainability as far as how development affects the water system. One of the legacy effects of coal mining and different extractive processes here is a kind of degrade. And I mean, there's other parts of how the area is developed, but our water quality is not very good. The river is a lot better than it has been, but it also is impacted. And so as we think about developing new businesses, new community amenities, we want to be kind of encouraging us to think about green infrastructure. And so we have installed also a small rain garden along the walking trail as a demonstration site of what kind of green infrastructure can look like. And then it can be beautiful. It's got some really nice flowers and trees, native plants. So I just, I think Bright kind of helped us think about a lot of these things, but they were also already being talked about, I think, by people in town. And as students, we were able to kind of like catalyze some of those conversations. And then as Apple Shop, and then the stakeholder group has developed, we've kind of run with that. We don't necessarily put Bright front and center as far as, we're doing the Bright model, all the time necessarily. But I think a lot of those principles have really been helpful for us, and help kind of spur on new ideas of what the low-hanging fruit is. Yeah. So now my dogs are barking. I can leave it at that for now. If Missy or Val, Shane, you'll want to chime in.
I would love to add one thing, just from sort of an urban planning perspective. You know, what I love about Whitesburg, and it's pretty typical of many Appalachian towns like this, is that while you may have little segmented areas of gridded development, you'll see the river that it segments the entire city. We sort of think of it as a string of pearls, where it's these little beautiful pearls that just need that connector. And I think that this Bright model has really been an effective tool to help think about all of these connections that everyone has spoken about, Marley and Missy and Val. But in terms of the water quality, you know, just the reality of how our communities develop beside these resources now creates impacts where, you know, typically in the spring we experience high water or flood impacts, which I think even more emphasizes some of that green infrastructure work around rain gardens and slowing down storm runoff that Marley and others are thinking about. So I just want to commend them for pulling from a lot of pieces and not getting so siloed and thinking about like how we solve this is to fix a building. That it really is a multi-dimensional effort that they're all vested in, and they're making this string of pearls a beautiful necklace.
Great. Thank you so much, Marley and Shane, for really highlighting what you spoke about. I think, you know, particularly there are a lot of communities that have a lot of different environmental justice issues. I think people often forget that water quality is something that affects a lot of communities, whether, you know, you're a coal mining town or, you know, you're a large city. People need access to healthy water, and planning about end uses that will improve people's water quality down the line is always helpful. I'm interested to know, and this is for the whole panel, what other, you know, persistent environmental justice issues affect your community, and also, you know, what metrics of success did you have along this plan? I think it was it was good to hear that, you know, while economics, you know, is a very important part of the way people live, that culture and community connections was another main focus of your plan.
That was a multi-part.
I apologize. I took that two ways. So yeah, if you want to, let's start off with EJ issues in general, you know, that sort of affect your community, but also drove some parts of the development.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can try to lead us off here, but you know, I think a lot of it has to do with legacy impacts from mining, from logging, from sort of extraction that's been, you know, done poorly in the past, and it's gotten somewhat better, but you know, there's also just these ongoing effects, and you know, I think that combined with the sort of decline in the industry, where there's fewer and fewer resources because of loss of tax revenue, loss of you know, employment, out-migration, has meant there are less resources to deal with increasing impacts, right? And so combine that with kind of persistent high levels of, you know, low income communities, and you end up with effects that are common across environmental justice communities wherever you are, and that's, you know, poorer health outcomes is a big one, right? And so health, you know, community health has been a big part of kind of our thinking about how to focus development, especially with the walking trail. Yeah, and then I think, you know, like a lot of shrinking towns and communities, we've got you know, old gas stations with tanks still in the ground. We've got dry cleaners, with continuing, kind of impacts from poor management of waste from that. Those are some of the things. I think water quality is a bigger impact than say air quality, right? I think air quality is a big impact that a lot of environmental justice communities, in other parts of the country experience. And I think we're, lucky to have fairly good air quality here. Lots of forests help with that, but water quality is a huge impact. I think we, at a municipal level, struggle to keep the water system, good and healthy and in maintenance, and that affects people's pocketbooks. It affects people's ability to access drinking water. I think for different parts of our community, drinking the municipal water is not a thing that's done. And if you expect that you might be taking on some risk. So that's a very real thing. So our wastewater system also is underfunded, disinvested, and then there's impacts. Those are some of the persistent environmental justice impacts I think we deal with. I don't know if Al, Missy, Shane, other perspectives on that.
I agree, and I echo a lot of what you say, Marley. I think it's really about that legacy of disinvestment, and when you don't take care of a place, things just start to fall apart, if you will. It's not that people don't care, but it's the reality of what the purse is. Whether we're talking about those coal severance tax revenues that communities have almost completely stopped getting compared to what they were getting. But then I think the other layer on top of this is a community that's trying to figure out what their future is. When for so many generations, we've kind of defined ourselves in some regards to the occupation that we're known for. I know it's something that as a young person from the mountains, I struggled with, was like, is my self-worth to other people more than the occupation of my grandfather? And I think you start to overlay some of those sort of identity sort of conversations on top of the reality of the landscape, and those issues just become persistent. And I think the loss of good paying jobs like the industry paid, that is another substantial piece. When your teachers and your sort of white collar county employees are some of the highest paid, and they're notoriously not paid that great, it starts to create a dynamic where you start to wonder who's going to make the investment, and how are we going to make the investment to address the things that we know. And that's the thing. It's not that folks are kind of have blinders on and are unwilling to notice that, once a month we get a notification that there's a boil water advisory. But it's that we literally don't have that resource to solve that ginormous problem. And it's one of the reasons that I really appreciate the way that Missy and others have approached it, as let's get people energized around these small projects that they can see. And we can all start to believe that if we work together and we sort of lay down some of those differences that we may have from the way that our parents' cousins treated each other a generation ago, that we can really get some things done. And I just want to echo, what Marley said, that it really is. It's that sort of long-term disinvestment, both in terms of human capital and sort of the built environment, that just compounds simple issues that become legacy issues that generations deal with.
If I have anything to add to that, it would be that I think that we're notorious for speaking negatively about ourselves, and we are notorious for talking about the problem, but seldom the solution, and maybe blame instead of just fixing it. So I think that may be what I'm hoping that we can be a part of a change more than anything, is that we want to fix what is wrong. We don't care who's at fault, and we don't care who gets the credit. But we see the positive, we see the sunsets and we see the rainbows We already know about all the other stuff. There's no need to keep talking about it. It's like my work family that I deal with. I'm like, okay, 10 years ago, I said, we're not going to talk about how economically deprived we are in this region. That is like saying the sun is coming out today. That is no longer a descriptive conversation that we're going to have about where we do business. We're going to embrace it, and we're going to try to make things better, and we're going to move forward. So I think that as a community, we have that mindset, and it's a shame that things had to get as desperate as they did for us to all align and realize how much we have in common and how much of the same thing we all want. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Missy. I think it's always very grounded to feel like, at the end of the day, it's just personal connections that really can start this off and really be the catalyst. Now we're gonna move over into the Q&A part of this panel. So please feel free to type your questions into the chat, and we can see, how much of these we can get to in the time allotted. One of the first questions is talking about, I think Marley mentioned earlier that he was a UVA student before really getting involved. And one of the questions was saying, how can communities connect with universities and colleges in the area to really, bolster their research and planning efforts?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm thinking about, Shane, has a connection with the University of Kentucky, and, through the sort of extension office, and that's a resource that's really common around the country. With your land grant universities is, kind of extension offices. And yeah, I was a student at UVA in the planning department, and the planning, the architecture, the landscape architecture departments, each of those had, especially for the graduate students, kind of capstone or a bigger project that they'd need to work on. And 6 months of, or a semester of 3 university students, or even 1 graduate student or whatever, can often can bring design assistance that is really hard to find for small communities, whether it's or underfunded communities especially. I'm trying to think about what's unique and what's also relevant about Whitesburg to other places as we're talking here. And I think one thing that's relevant to a lot of environmental justice communities is there's just not a lot of resources locally to take some of those first small steps even towards kind of design and planning and communities coming together, right? In Whitesburg, our city, and towns all over here, city governments, municipalities have lost a lot of funding as tax bases have shrunk, as populations have shrunk, as people have left. And whereas, in a city that's growing, in a town that's growing, because people are moving there and there's more jobs, there's usually resources at a town level to support planning and development and community visioning. And that's just been really hard to do here. And so little pieces of help from universities, from nonprofits, from, I think the arts organizations can go a long way to kind of like catalyzing some of these first steps of design and visioning, and then identifying low-hanging fruit. So I would say, I think planning, architecture, community development, economic development programs at universities that are, near other towns, ought to be engaging, I think, more with communities that are looking for new, ways to move forward. And yeah, so I was at UVA. We've also worked with a group out of Virginia Tech. There's a community design assistance center there that's worked both with Whitesburg and with other communities here in Eastern Kentucky and Southwest Virginia. And they've provided a lot of helpful design. Sometimes just having a professionally drawn this is what this building could look like, can be, or what this walking trail could look like, or what this map, how it could change, can be really not, I don't want to say inspiring, but it can just clarify action, can clarify like some of the steps that can be taken. Sometimes it's just hard for, folks that don't necessarily have that background or whatever to, or those resources or that time, right? It's just very hard to find the time sometimes to take these extra steps when you're, fighting for every grant dollar to keep your nonprofit open, or, working overtime to run a business and work on the tourism committee like Missy. So yeah, I think departments like that should be doing more, can be doing more to support EJ communities in these kinds of design, and then identifying implementation steps.
Can I add one thing here? And I think Marley hit the nail on the head in terms of extension. So most folks think of extension as helping farmers, and traditionally that's the role, right? But most extension, and if you're familiar, some people call it the cooperative extension office or cooperative extension. Every land grant institution in America has that footprint within their states that they serve. And I often tell people in Kentucky, our extension agents are the most sort of underappreciated and underutilized resource that's available in every county. That's often the largest footprint of your institutions in terms of their public facing entity. But one cautionary tale I would share in terms of working with universities, as someone who has spent my career working at the University of Kentucky, working with communities, is that I have seen excellent community partnerships and I have seen detrimental partnerships. And I think having a firm understanding from the beginning, from a community perspective, of sort of what your expectation is from those of the academics or of the other professional staff like myself is really important. Because what you don't want to do as a community is to fall into one of those scenarios that I've seen play in multiple places, where in the auspice of community engagement, the community becomes a research subject to help sort of promote and push the academic through their professional career. I would caution communities, if you start to feel that red flag may be there for a reason. But those relationships and expectations that you set with the individual partners or those professional staff that you work with, and the relationships you build with them are more important than probably the skill set that you think that partner may have when you first start that conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Shane. I think it was a very good, word of warning to be like, hey, some of these things comes with string attached. You don't want to end up being the subject of your work rather than being the ones controlling, your innovation. And I think that raises another pretty interesting point about, how does this all get paid for, right? Like, what are the funding avenues that are available to communities, outside of, let's say, a university? So if anyone wants to jump in and give, a quick, how this work got done financially, or speak to it to your best of your abilities.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to Shane, you want to go ahead? I think you're muted. Yeah, we can highlight some of the funding sources over. It's changed for sure, and will continue to change. I would say in a lot of places it should come from a municipality that maybe has more consistent funding than nonprofits. So some of the funding for my work has been funded by private foundations that have supported Appalshop on other fronts and wanted to encourage arts organizations in places like Eastern Kentucky to think about and engage with creative placemaking and community development projects. And so there were kind of two private foundations that have supported Appalshop doing that work. But if anybody's familiar with private foundations, sometimes they'll have a 2 or 3 year funding cycle, and then they'll want to prioritize a different thing or a different place. And so, we've experienced that. It's becoming less certain how Appalshop specifically will be able to like stay engaged with this. We're going to continue to try, but it is a little bit outside of our kind of like core wheelhouse of making media and arts, right? It's clearly related and supports our mission. I think we've had some federal dollars through the Appalachian Regional Commission that supported the work of Shane and CEDIC. We have recently received a $25,000 grant from the AARP. AARP, I think, is an interesting kind of foundation that has started to really think about how they can make places more healthy and accessible and support community development for aging folks. It's an important thing as people age, that they have the option to age in place, and ideally that's best served by accessible amenities and resources and stuff. So I think those are some of the funding sources that we've been through. I think Tourism Committee, is a commission of the county, and they receive some funds from hotel stays and occupation fees, but that's a small amount here right now, right? I think in other places that's a more it's a bigger dollar amount. We've lost a lot of lodging here in the last 10 years as the economy's declined. So Missy's been able to do a lot with a little. And then there's a lot of private businesses that have, in meaningful, sometimes small, sometimes very big ways, engaged in different aspects of this work because they know it's in their best interest that, the town be a more accessible place. And I think helping businesses to see that can also bring them on board in meaningful ways. Sometimes that's, sponsoring a concert series. And so a lot of the, we've mentioned a few times, but cultural events have been a big part of how we've built relationships in this and how we've done small things together that then helps us do bigger things. So street festivals, concert series. And so private businesses have been a big part of that. And then, private businesses have also chipped in, more serious dollars to help push the ball across and get some of these projects done, especially with the bowling building. We've had some major private investment in that effort to get it kind of across with kind of matching grant funds. Anything I miss?
One thing
Yeah.
I would add, no, go ahead, Missy.
I was just going to agree with what Marley said, but I think because we have so many tangible things that people can see that are getting done, we do have private businesses or private individuals that want to know how they can get involved. I've been lucky enough to literally get phone calls from people saying, what can I sponsor? What can I help with? Because they see results. So I think that's the secret to the buy-in and the momentum is the results. The frustrating thing for me being in private business is how long grants take. It's, you really got to have some endurance and some tenacity to stick it out for the length of a grant cycle, a grant life after you're awarded. But, grants that tourism goes after, AML, which is Abandoned Mine Lands, DLG, Department of Local Government, ARC, which Marley mentioned, EDA, but, the local community seeing something worth investing in, I think speaks more than anything. And to this conversation, something that we have all talked about is a strategic plan so that as we each get funding, we can, purposefully choose what to spend that money on, that we all agree as a community from one border to the other, that is our plan, so that strategically we can apply for and invest in our community. So that is the next thing that I would like to see done. And I know Marley and I've talked about it, Bella and I've talked about it, and I've talked to Shane about it at length, along with the mayors and the judge. And, I'm like a broken record, I guess you could say, but I would love to have a 20-year plan that we work on in 5-year increments so that we can really see some large scale results.
And one thing I would add to that in terms of thinking about that strategic plan that sort of really prioritizes investments. One of the things that we haven't mentioned as we were talking about sort of the specific EJ communities and impacts in Letcher County, one thing we didn't really mention was we alluded to it, but there's this over many years has been a general depopulation. And when the coal economy took early hits in the 40s and through the 60s, and we had mass depopulation of people moving to Ohio and Michigan, working in the auto plants, we had a huge transfer of wealth where people are in those areas now with a lot of money. They still have strong connections to their home place. Oh my gosh, I have a fire alarm going on here at the University of Kentucky. I'm sorry. But let me just say this briefly, is that community foundations and sort of the vehicle to bring that investment together is critical. I love you all. It's been a pleasure. I will join back if I can. Let me see what's going on. Thank you.
Be safe.
It's one of the few great parts about the Zoom world. You can get a fire alarm in Kentucky that, interrupts a meeting. But, not to get held up on that. There are a couple questions about, federal infrastructure, but also, brownfields planning. And I think the 20-year plan that Missy mentioned can go a very long way to, integrating those, new funding sources into a plan that is already developed. I think I'm just looking through the chat. There was a question about, tax incentives and more, creative funding opportunities. But I think Marley and Missy, you guys really covered a lot of the pitfalls, but also, the opportunities that are available by going through non-traditional funding sources. To go back to a question I asked earlier, what were, let's say, your metrics of success, even if they weren't sort of financial? When you look at your community now, how do you sort of identify, this is the work that we have done and we've done this work well?
Al, or Missy, you want to take the first crack at that? Curious. Yeah, I think, it's tough. In grants that we've written, we've had metrics like, 10% more people using the walking trail, as measured here and here in these ways. COVID made some of that more difficult. But also, I think during COVID, we saw one really strong metric of success, which was a lot more people using the walking trail, right? I think it became clear that we had better developed this asset. We had extended the trail longer than it was, and people were using it, for exercise, to meet up in a safe outdoor environment, to walk to the grocery store. So I think that's been, a thing that really comes to mind for me. I think the part of it is really wanting to see tangible changes. And I think that's, we've sort of every 6 months or so have been able to add a new thing in the built environment in downtown Whitesburg that shows that things are continuing to happen, right? First, it was kind of, some small signs on the walking trail. Then it was the walking trail was extended with new gravel, and then it was these kind of solar installations that you could see right on the walking trail. The rain garden, pieces of the sidewalk getting fixed, additions to the pavement to make bike friendly, share lanes. So I think that's been a guiding principle for us too, is that we want to dream big and think about the long term and develop a plan, but also, yeah, to see concrete changes in the built environment as we go. Yeah, I think another thing that feels like a metric that was a goal from the beginning, right, was to encourage kind of private enterprises to work on redevelopment of buildings. And so I was just in the slides we were showing earlier, there was a vacant building that's a pretty old stone building on one end of town that was vacant in 2017 and has over the last year been revitalized and kind of redeveloped. And there's a law firm in the downstairs and I think an apartment upstairs. And so we've seen, sort of initiative taken by groups that are kind of outside of this initial stakeholder group, to find ways to invest in the built environment in town. Somewhat comes to mind. Missy, you got any thoughts about metrics, how we've measured for success?
So yeah, I this is definitely not measurable, but in my opinion, one of the goals that I wanted to try to achieve is to knock down as many silos as we could. As a whole across the county, there was lots of individual groups with priorities, but no one really linked arms and worked together. So I think that's one of the things that I'm proud of is, there's a lot of diversity in this group that's on this call. And I'm sure if we had an intentional conversation, we could see what we all disagree on, but we choose not to have those conversations. We choose to talk about what we agree on and how we can work together and how we can make things happen. So I think the mutual, team effort and less silos is a huge thing for this community because it's historically, how we've kind of been set up. And the results that Marley mentioned, the fact that, goes back to the tangible comments. There's been years and years of conversation about things that are possibilities, but you never saw anything come to fruition. They were just conversations. Another thing that I use as my own personal gauge is how proud our community is. We as a group don't care who gets credit and we don't care who knows who did what, but the fact that our community is using the assets that we've been able to provide as a community, whether it's the overlooks or it's what, the projects we're talking about in downtown, there's not a whole lot of shout out about where those things come from, but there is an enormous amount of shout out on social media from the community about how you can see the pride because of the pictures and the events in the spaces that we've been able to polish those apples. And, because of all of those things I just mentioned, I can't even imagine the possibilities that are ahead of us. I think the silos have held us back too long. So if I could be a small part of those silos being torn down, then that will be the gauge of the success in my book.
Thank you, Missy and Marley, for really, highlighting that there are other ways to measure success than, what's on paper. Missy, I think this is a question for you, but there's a question about how to get, I guess, descendants of people that used to live in the Whitesburg community but moved out for a variety of reasons. What efforts are being done to, I guess, get people to come back and visit or, lay down the roots again?
So funny that you say that because of the pandemic, we have seen an increase in population. Where it be lightly, I can tell you from, like the school system has an increase in population, both an independent school system in the upper end of the county and our central school system. We have a house shortage right now. I mean, I didn't think those words would ever come out of my mouth, but you cannot find a house to buy in this community because people are moving from cities that were originally from here back because of things that they experienced during the pandemic. And then we have new citizens that are working from home that have, chosen this area to live in for, cost of living being low and, the price of real estate is relatively low. So I'm guessing their investment was well worth it. One, I have Airbnbs in the area, and during the year that basically the world was shut down, I saw people from New York, Las Vegas, New Orleans, Boston, and they were just passing through. They were moving around and spending time together as family, but they were going to low populated places and staying in places they felt safe and that were clean. So I can't explain it. There's no scientific study proving it, but I do see new people. And I have lots and lots and lots of calls. If I had the resources, I could rent 10 apartments and 5 houses today, because there are people looking for housing right now that are not from here. Can't explain it.
Thank you, Missy. We really appreciate it. Marley, do you want to say something?
No, not really. I mean, I think there's not enough efforts, I would say, to tap into, especially folks that have moved out of the area, and I'd say we could do more there.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for, I guess, one more question. I think this is probably for Alda. So there's a question about, I guess, legal mechanisms that people are using to sort of get out from, cleanup costs or, environmental damages that they have done. What, Alda, have you seen is one of those methods, or a couple of those mechanisms that, I guess, private individuals or state or local governments will try to use to skirt the blame?
To avoid cleanup costs, yeah, this is kind of, so Superfund, a lot of the original legislation was set up to try to kind of like capture companies' legacy over time. There are carve outs within these, because it sort of resulted in somewhat of a vicious cycle in which some areas actually wouldn't get cleaned up even by sort of companies that were sort of like and developers who were well-meaning, because they feared sort of like essentially buying up the properties would expose them to essentially the liability for harms that had not been sort of like part of their own sort of like damages. So there was kind of like these, so some of those carve outs have sort of like, though they increased some development and sort of like some purchases for beneficial use, those have sometimes been used as loopholes. But more traditionally, sort of, it is some of the things that this question mentioned, sort of like transferring ownership and selling ownership. Some companies just tend to sort of go out of business after a while. Sort of a lot of the industrial strips in this country, often from companies left over, lead plants, manufacturing companies that are no longer existing in their original corporate form. They may have been bought out or have changed ownership in other ways that make it difficult to actually sort of attach liability to them. Legally speaking, there's kind of been there's been a lot of cases in this area, and it is difficult and it's expensive to bring those cases at all. So sometimes, you will just have kind of a lack of ability to essentially even start up some of these projects because of that. So that's definitely an issue that needs to be addressed. And Superfund and sort of like these like kind of things that have been set up to address this issue as a collective action issue have been long underfunded. So that's kind of a structural kind of issue that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, we have a slightly related situation here that, I think is probably very common across communities, but and there was a specific question I was trying to type an answer to in the Q&A about, we worked with Kentucky Department of Environment Protection and the Brownfields program. We actually did work with them. We identified from that student plan, identified potential brownfield sites in the downtown. We looked at one and worked with the property owner and the KY Department of Environmental Protection to do a phase 1 assessment of the property, and they recommended a phase two. And so we started talking to the property owner, and they were, really concerned, maybe rightfully so, about their potential liability. They were interested in potentially donating this property to a nonprofit or to the city to support it being turned into an asset. It's mostly vacant right still, but we had a really hard time figuring out how to kind of minimize their liability, recognizing that, I mean, it's sort of like it was a past use by a previous owner. This person bought that property, right? And then they've held on to it for a number of decades, probably 30 years since that past use. Didn't continue that past use. They were interested in kind of committing it to good, reuse, but worried about how they could avoid, potentially millions of dollars of cleanup fees and liabilities. And we couldn't really figure it out. Part of it is that we don't have a lot of legal expertise or, kind of expertise in our community to kind of wrestle with that. And, part of it was we just thinking about the potential sums of money was just, very hard for us to imagine. It's like, yes, Kentucky Brownfields has some funds to help with these things, but if you run into, a legacy use that has, big ground contamination and the full cleanup is $1 million, the Kentucky Brownfield system doesn't have, that capacity or not a lot of it, right? And the federal grants are, very competitive, underfunded, difficult to get those kinds of sums of money. And then when you're missing the private investment part, it's really hard to kind of move that forward. So we're still interested in it. It felt like this is not necessarily a low hanging fruit. This is a higher hanging fruit, and we want to build up, some of these small things before we start really tackling some of those things. And hopefully, hopeful that ELI and their partners could help us navigate that in the future. But yeah, I mean, that's
just a brief note that sort of ELI has published many resources that sort of specifically talk about sort of brownfields because it is a very complicated and liability strewn area of law. And then again, sort of we'll just mention that the Bright team is going to be publishing a interactive guide, which will have sort of some of the basics about brownfields and sort of cleanup. And sort of these things do get more specific, and because each property is sort of unique, it often requires like sort of specific consultation, but some of those resources can at least get folks started understanding the scope of the liability that might exist.
Thank you, Alda. Thank you, Marley. Thank you, Missy. Thank you, Shane. I forgot to thank Valerie while she was still on the call, but I really appreciate everything that was said in this panel, and I'm glad that ELI has been recording. Shane's back. Wonderful. Okay. I'm really excited that this was recorded, and I'm glad ELI will make this available. So I think with that, I think we can end this panel with 1 minute to spare. Thank you everyone for coming out, logging in from your respective places. We really appreciate the engagement, and we think, more events like this will just keep bringing on, positive energy into these communities. Thank you again.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Thank Noble as well.
Appreciate the time. Yeah.